So good morning, and I am very happy to be here. Yes, Australia is far. I confirm the experience is actually on a first skin, but it's worth because it's a country that has been thriving in the global economy for so long now. And I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation about growth today, but we'll try to package it maybe with a different perspective through what we call the power of the megatrends. Millions of people have now that become part of the global economy. In my lifetime, the population stock has doubled. In the 70s, we were at 3.5 billion. Now we are actually above 7 billion. And our economic system were never designed for that excess of capacity, if you want to put it this way. So we have always, to some extent, been obsessed with growth, but the obsession is something that we have inherited mainly in the industrial times. If you're looking at the overall GDP performance of the world, since we could actually find data for it, we had very little aggregates. So the world never really operated in terms of large aggregates, but as we started to industrialize more and more, we started to know that the growth would actually concentrate into the top. So in fact, in the 20th and 21st century, growth has been synthesized to something that looks like this. It's uncomparable to any history, in any point in time in history we have ever had. So any ability that we have to learn from the past to forecast the future is great as an exercise, but it's statistically relevant because the amount of volume that is now currently interfacing the data streams make it actually impossible to have the same standard deviation to the point in which we can get a certain type of understanding of what's happening. So every single day, we're finding ourselves that our traditional predictive models are not really working as well as before, mainly because the conditions have changed. They not only change in terms of where growth is going, but they also change in terms that most of our predictive analytics, it tends to be inherited by the 20th century when we had an entirely different set of values that we're gauging to understand where growth is right now. So we find more and more in the US and in Europe more than in the side of the world that it's becoming very difficult to forecast growth. Now, interesting, which is also sort of like the undercurrent theme of this conference, we have never been so rich as these days. We are at about 300 trillion in the financial assets in the financial economy, which is, of course, the economy that is powered primarily by financial institutions and financial firms, but we are about 75 trillion in the real economy. Just for you to have a sense of how much have we grown from 1995, which is our most interesting point in time, we grew about 45% of capital across every possible dimension. So we are in the superabundant capital for real. It's not just a cliche. We've never been so rich as a society. And it's always converted in proportion by the number of people living in the world. But why don't we have this perspective? Mainly because growth does no longer concentrate to the top, but now much more scale out. So it's becoming very difficult to think about a standardized flow of information that only aggregates at the top. So how do we find this growth when there is capital, but it's no longer distributed in the same way it was distributed before? So this was a quest we had with my co-author Terence C. for quite some time. And we started to interview hundreds of CEOs around the world. We wanted to go to the C-suites and understanding how do they find growth. And so what we discovered is that they don't look at growth in the same way we used to look at growth before. We clearly had a change of the orientation since the end of the 90s towards an entirely different way of thinking about growth, much more into what we call the dormant markets. The dormant markets are markets in which the demand is there. The demand is dormant because it's not animated by a supply process, but is actually very lucrative. So all of this large business model that we now look at the unicorns startup, like for example Uber or Airbnb, they did not replace taxi companies or hotels. They added to the economy in a way in which those products are ancillary, but they're also parallel to this. There's still a large amount of people that are using taxis, like there are a number of people that are using Uber. So we didn't have a substitute like we thought. It was mainly expanding the pie in a way in which it was not verticalized, but it was across the different system. Most of growth these days does not verticalize anymore. It tends to be distributed across the channels. And most of it tend not to be captured by macroeconomic analysis. So most of our predictive analytics that tends to capture macro and try to determine whether the macro can be normalized with a specific rule tends to be actually ineffective because growth simply does not perform there anymore. So we tried to get into a journey, and the journey was how do we find some of the major plots where growth can be found. And we discovered that Across these 5 different plots that I'll spend some time now, which gave the name to our work, it gave the name to the framework, it became an easy way for us to think about promoting the DRIVE framework. It's an easy name to remember. We discovered that there are 5 main plots that are really common to most markets in the world. The first one, we also heard from Michael before, is demographics. We have gone through the most outstanding transformation of our population pyramid in history. Never in history we had such a different type of composition between population segments. For most of history, in terms of from the 1700 until 1970, population was considered to be a population pyramid because kids were the larger part of the pyramid. Now, I'm going to show you later in an animated graph, it's no longer the case. We're no longer going to have a world population that will be primarily driven by kids, but we're going to have quite even number of people distributed from 0 to about 59. Now, while this is somehow the result of emerging economies that by becoming emergent, they acquire more spending capital, they have more per capita spending, they go into family planning, they tend to increase their educational output, and therefore they reduce the number of kids per family. At the same time, it changes dramatically our model for productivity, which are based on the offspring supposedly working for us and as we retire. Also bear in mind that Social Security in the US was introduced when life expectancy was at the age of 63. So people were expected to live a few years after going on retirement, but not 25 or 30. And so most of our social compacts, from healthcare to all of the things that define social welfare, were designed on the expectation of life expectancy being different, on productivity outputs being different, and on the number of people working in the workforce to being different. I'm pretty sure you're experiencing in this side of the world like we are in the US, the artificial intelligence and robotics are changing the nature of work. We are entering into 4th industrial revolution, which is the interface of biological design and technology at the pace we've never seen before. It's the first time in history where a 3rd and a 4th industrial revolution are happening concurrently. We used to think about industrial revolution being subsequent one to the other. So we had the first, we had the second, we had the third, and it was always proportional and on a linear progression. Now 3rd and 4th are happening simultaneously. The interesting part is that they might happen simultaneously in the same country. So you can have a country like India, for example, where it's still discovering the rise from 2nd to 3rd, mainly because of Modi's strategy to reinforce manufacturing. So there's a lot of traditional infrastructure work in the country, but then India has a space program, which is pushing them in the forefront between 3rd and 4th, and they also have invented the frugal innovation model, the Jugaad innovation, which is an interesting way for them to be at the forefront of the 3rd and the 4th. The same happened for countries like Japan, where you can think about they are right in the 4th industrial revolution, but their social infrastructure tends to now struggle because of the number of women not integrating the workforce and the fact that they start having, as we heard before, population recession. So there are a number of countries that do not experience a specific cookie cutter experience about being part of only one type of revolution. We have multiple concurrent revolutions happening at the same time. Now, this is unprecedented. We have never had anything like this at this speed in our modern history. So we can't resort back to the past to determine what will happen. We can only determine what's happening by asking the question, where is growth, how is it moving, and how quickly can I possibly react? So demographics is a big chunk of our work. We notice that as you're changing your population segments, you're also changing how you're targeting products and services to this specific type of industry. Most of our products and services, they tend to be calibrated around either kids or working professional, hardly too senior. But there's a rise of silver economy that is going to teach us a way of packaging products and services for a part of the population that's increasing in number. Just to give you a funny teaser, in Japan, diapers for adults, they sell 26% per year more than diapers for kids. And a company like Unilever has to figure out in which way am I going to enter into a market where my main consumer for diaper will not be kids. Now imagine all the products that are related to this, from infrastructure to architectural projects, to housing, to consumer goods, to fast consumer goods, to a fitness center. There's a lot of impact by changing our population pyramid towards a different type of chemistry, to put it this way. Now, the second large plot that we found somehow inevitable to deal with is what we call resource scarcity. We are living in a world in which some resources are becoming very abundant, like, for example, energy. We're currently experiencing a bonanza of energy around the world. Just a few years ago, this conversation would have never been able to be possible. But now we have more energy than what we actually thought. We could actually run an entirely zero marginal cost model with solar, but we cannot afford energy to be entirely free, because energy somehow is a large catalyst and a capacitator for a number of different industries that keeps the economic incentive in place. So most likely energy company in the future will become APIs. They'll become more platform companies, facilitating the access of energy from one household to the other. But energy so far is not where we're having most of our worries, but in things like natural resources, water, and even lithium, which is now powering the global revolution of electric vehicle. Well, the largest reservoir of lithium are in Chile, followed by China. But most of the consuming countries don't have lithium as a reserve. So will we be able to have enough resource to run in our electric vehicle revolution? So there are many of these considerations that remind us every single day that we can economically presume that we have infinite growth, but we're always going to be bound to the reality that our planet is not infinite. So whenever we're shifting our model of production around some degree of materiality, we're always going to be confined to what is available or not. I'm going to give you a perspective on water specifically, because I think it makes sense for us to have a look at this. Water is where there is a lot of threats, but equally a lot of opportunity. If capital could go into water management, the lucrative models will be exponential, because we're going to reduce the cost of something which is becoming increasingly important and increasingly scarce. Now, you've been hearing this from most of the headlines for past decades right now, but in the last 10 years, we have institutionalized the problem with inequality. We are, as I mentioned before, the most capital abundant era in history, but we're also the most uneven distributed time in history. Never in history, since we had the Gini coefficient, we have been so unequal. And this is mainly because of a large disparity between financial assets and real economy, and the fact that there is no incentive for money to ever be redistributed back into the real economy. If you are in the financial assets, you can easily multiply 1 billion into 2 without hiring any single person, simply by putting your assets somewhere else. But if you are in the real economy, any transaction that implies factors of production will of course create a cost. So what are the incentives for financial assets to reinvest their money back in the real economy? There are not many. The problem is that if you're depleting the consumption critical mass, then most businesses over time will suffer and deplete. So how do we keep, on one side, the rationale of having a return on our investment, a return on our capital employed, but at the same time, how do we make sure that this is not only becoming an abstract amount of money that is being decoupled from the real economy? And this is a very subtle challenge that we have to address, because economically we can say it makes sense to multiply benefits and maximizing our shareholder value. But if there is no redistribution back into the economy, in the long term, we're actually depleting the collective or the collaborative commons, which is what is creating the wealth in the first place. Now, from DR&I, we explore everything that has to do with IT and technology and the disrupting technology. So you hear it every single day, the revolution about fintech, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics. How much of this is a fad and how much of this is real? Well, we think it's actually real in terms of having done what the system is designed to do. The system is designed to become efficient and increase productivity, and we are doing this. There's much more productivity today in terms of labor productivity than 20 years ago. There's much more efficiency in how we're extracting value from our assets than 20 years ago. The problem with the technology that if it's not designed to maximize human well-being, it won't be enough. What's the point of having a highly efficient society when we have created the highest level of inefficiency through unemployment? So you see, again, it's a catch-22. Am I going to go and replace in labor because I think it will actually make sense to have a 30% cut in my overhead? Or will I decide to preserve some part of the labor force? Because if I do not, in the long term, I'm going to have even more dire unintended consequences. The ability for us to become reflective, looking at the long term in a strategic way, understanding that efficiency is not the way human society are designed to operate indefinitely, understanding that we need to have some degree of human interaction in every single process for the process to become what we call societies is an important reflection. We can't let technology do what technology is designed to do, because we will become unemployable by not our own fault. The same way in which the horse population in 1915 never thought that they would actually start decreasing, because why would they ever be replaced by cars? And now, in fact, the horse population is decimated in comparison to what used to be 100 years ago. So we can't afford to have an efficiency-driven conversation when we are somehow impacted by human drivers that needs to be considered in the first place. This extremely interesting balance between humanization of our economy and efficiency of the economy will be one of the major challenges we're going to have in the next years ahead. How will we prioritize what does not make economic sense? It's pretty much how we can see this dilemma presenting itself to us. From here, and the fact that technology is going to increase volatility, we see this with the cryptocurrency, which are nothing more than a sentimental representation of how we feel, nothing that is actually really a real value. There is no physical form of the cryptocurrency. It's really still hard to imagine what's the intrinsic value of a cryptocurrency, but they are there. They are the first experiment of bypassing currency outside the central banks, and they have impacted to some extent the financial plaza. So how will we deal with increasing volatility that makes it very difficult for us to forecast, especially in systems that were designed for stability and growth? And finally, where is innovation coming from? Well, it's not coming from rich countries anymore. A rich country have a huge cost of innovating. The research and development is not the most effective way of yielding results, because there's a lot of cost for very little returns, many years to come up with a breakthrough. There's a lot of protection around IPs and patents and how the market is regulated. So most of our innovation is no longer coming from the Western economies. They're coming from the emerging economies. They learn to do very, very comparable type of products with way less capital. And we're going to have one example specifically to the US and China, just to put them in perspective. So that's kind of a menu of what I'd like to talk to you today. Really, these 5 megatrends that we find common to every single organization that we have interviewed. So we did the secondary data first and primary data afterwards. We want to go out there and determine in which way this research was being impacted by the experience of the CEO. And so we came up with 5 megatrends because they happen to have the highest frequency, but of course there are many more to consider. The first one I mentioned is this: where will capital naturally shift? This is our population stock in the year 2000. So you guys know this already, that we have been shifting more and more towards a 25 to 59 segment on a global population. So the projection to 2050 in population trends, unless something major happens, this seems to be one of the safest predictor how the future will look like. That's the evolution of population by 2050. It will significantly be unbalanced towards the 25 to 59. You notice that 0 to 9 and 10 to 24 together, they are not even close to be the same number of people in 25 to 59. Bear in mind that what is wrong with this is nothing is wrong other than our socioeconomic system are not designed for this type of distribution. So we're going to have a lot of pressure in systems that were designed for a different type of outlook. And how will we recalibrate most of our economic and social welfare system to represent this reality? You also see that the 60 and plus, they're becoming a large chunk of our world population. Now, for you to have a sense of the transformation, population pyramid used to finish at the age of 84. Now we had to add an additional category of 85 and plus, which is the fastest growing segment in the entire population pyramid. They'll grow by 280% in the next 20 years, but from a much smaller base. So they don't add as much to the population as if it was happening somewhere else. But it shows you how the trend is really going into some degree of acceleration. Where this is going to be particularly true, of course, on a global level, country that will champion this to the point in which it will become very visible will be European countries, where you guys see the number of people that will be over 60, and of course Japan, which it'll become by 2030 the country with an average age of 51.6. They're currently 49.7, followed by Italy, that will become the second oldest country on earth, and Germany. These countries, they are becoming old mainly because they have clearly experienced decades of prosperity. We had a country that have been important from the perspective of what they contributed to the global economy, but they have not been either very open to immigration. That's specifically the case for Italy and Germany, that for a long period of time they had rarely controlled immigration. Now it's changing. And of course, Japan is a very closed system. So their immigration policy does not let people flow to the country as much as we like to, although bear in mind that the largest community of non-Japanese residing in Japan is of course Chinese, right? So China and Japan, they might look at each other in the eyes in the more political perspective by showing some sort of force between, for example, disputes on the islands or trade war. But in real terms, when we're kind of removing all the politics behind this, they have been working together for a long time. So one good hope for Japan will be the influx of people coming from China that will keep on moving towards the country in the same way as Japanese cars, they sell in record numbers in China. So the two countries are currently much more strategic in their partnership than what we can think of. Now, population pyramid changing brings a different type of composition of our population. It will become very visible in what we call the urbanization process. We are an urbanized civilization, but will become even more so. We currently are about 50 to 60% urbanized. The trend will be by 2030 to be 75% urbanized. And the interesting story is that urbanization will not only happen with people moving from non-urbanized area to cities, but it will also bring an entirely different economic geography. Just to give you some perspective on this, most of the world GDP will be concentrated in what we can call 50 urban archipelagos, which will be the concentration of wealth. To give you an example, right? There is no Japan outside of Tokyo, Osaka, which is 80% of the Japan GDP. London is about 40% of the UK GDP. Mexico City is 60% of Mexican GDP. Turkey is 60% of Turkish GDP. Jakarta is about 50% of Indonesian GDP. Sao Paulo is 40%. The US, the Boston-Washington corridor and the San Francisco to Los Angeles corridor, it's about a third of the US GDP. So more and more economic power will shift from nation state to cities. So the rise of city-states, or city as the emblem of the 21st century, is actually in the making. Mayors today have much more power than before. I'm pretty sure you saw how the Mayor Khan from London was able to challenge and contend President Trump directly on Twitter. It would have been unthinkable a few years ago that the city mayor can actually face a country leader. But it's happening more and more. How would we look like if our economic performance of city would be representing global governance? Today we talk about G7 or G20, but some cities have more economic power than countries. To give you an example of the Pearl River Delta, which is the area near Hong Kong, Guangzhou, that's the most sophisticated logistical hub in the world. They are about 80 million people with the same GDP of India. It's unbelievable. So one of the large revelations of the last few years is that economic power is not only shifting towards city, but it's changing economic geography. So we can expect in the next few years that more and more cities will pop up as becoming major contender to the world economy. Will our institutional framework be ready to capture this? It's a difficult question to ask. We always resist changes that are primarily disrupting power structures. And this is going to disrupt primarily power structure because we're going to devolute power from central governments towards peripheries. But what's happened in 2016 and 17, on one side with Brexit and the other side with the Catalonia experience a few weeks ago, is that you cannot stop natural justice. You can slow it down, you can repress it, but eventually natural justice prevails. So more and more people will try to redefine self-determination around cities. We'll have to imagine how will we allow this city to be part of the global economies in the same way in which we think countries should be part of the global economy. But with city rising at that pace, urbanization becomes a string of possible issues. So you see some of the issues that are collateral to urbanization. Two I like to spend time with, one by expressing a possibility and the other one to show you more of the data, is waste management. What will we do with an increasing amount of waste that not every country is capable of processing? That's a big conversation. Accenture argues that if we're able to have a significant part of the waste reintegrated back into the economy, which answer again, where is growth? So let's say that we have between 30 to 50% of waste that is going to go back into open loop, manufacturing, some sort of recycling, conversion of material to advance through green chemistry, in which, for example, plastic will become construction material or things like this. So whenever we can tap on the existing waste to turn it back into resources, we unleash about $4.5 trillion US in the economy, and we hire 40 million people. It shows you that growth no longer works in the same way of expecting growth to be by a country following traditional predictive model, raising their competitiveness, increasing standard of living. It's also about improving economic infrastructure. And the economic infrastructure platform of the 21st century is still on a stock of the 20th century. So things like this are important for us, not only to think about the right things to do in terms of managing an environmental problem, but also how by shifting to an entirely different economic infrastructure, we unleash opportunity both in terms of the employability, that in terms of the net value that we can extract from waste. Where we spend some time, where we have an issue and an opportunity, as I mentioned before, is water. So water, as you can see, this is urbanization rush. So I want to show you before I go into water. This is only China, just to show you how China will keep on rising in the next few years. So it shows you the current urbanization of the Chinese cities. You see different colors. A large part of the country is still not fully urbanized. Imagine when the rest of the country will be urbanized, what type of economic impact this country has. Just for us to have a point of reference, China is now the largest market size in the world, with about 400 million active Chinese. We have a disposable income of about $14,000. They are now second to the US. They produce 14 trillion. US is about 22, 23. All it takes is this country to increase by 15 to 20% their active spender in the economy, that they will become the largest GDP of the world. They are by far already the largest economy on planet, with the exception of GDP. But GDP is nothing more than a representation of wealth versus the number of people in the country. So they'll take them a bit longer before they can raise the labor costs and bring productivity up to the point in which their GDP per capita will rise. But it's a matter of time. So we're looking at the future when we're looking at where most of our world economy will be shifted in terms of the epicenter. In terms of resources, I mentioned before, where this interesting growth will create issue, of course, will be water. This is the water global demand as we have measured it from 2013 to 2050. Now, this assumes business as usual, so hopefully this graph will never become reality. You know there's differences between OECD, BRICS, with Indonesia included in that, rest of the world and the world as a whole, because water is a global resource. At the end of the day, it makes sense to look at the global axis, right? You see that there is increasing needs for water. If you have to put it down in numbers, the rich country will deflect water consumption because they're shrinking in terms of size, but everybody else is increasing. If you're looking at the world total demand for water by 2050 with 37% more, do we have this water? We don't right now. Right? So where do we have to put capital? In the ability to manage water differently, to actually correct hidden water consumption. There's a lot of water that's actually consumed in hidden ways. Just to give you an example, a pair of jeans will require about 12,000 liters of water. And if we don't see this, it will never happen to be in the account statement. So how can we visualize the hidden cost of water and now use financial instruments to decrease that? The same happened for most of our electricity, manufacturing. So where a lot of opportunity will actually dwell will be in things like vertical farming, urban farming, to some extent GMO if they're proven to be clinically okay. We don't know yet. But the idea that agriculture will play a major role in the years to come is an important consideration to have. For too long, we have ignored agriculture because we thought, why should we care? It's not interesting for people like us to work in agriculture. And we know this because agriculture only counts for 3% of global GDP, against 70% of services and 27% of manufacturing. Now, how do we bring the power of technology to agriculture? So agri-tech, as I've been hearing it, is an important conversation. If we can invest in agriculture, our return will be massive. Because if you corrected a very ineffective industry that now has a very poor yield, mainly because of climate change and because of the fact the frequency cycle have changed, imagine how much value we can extract. So how do we mobilize billions of dollars to go towards agriculture and turn it into an activity where we can extract value. It's a perfect win-win in many ways. We're addressing an industry or a sector that's been declining for too long, but at the same time, we'll keep on having rising needs. I have just a data for you to share. If we're not fixing this, the cost of food in 2030 in countries like China will increase by 230%. The cost of food in rich country will be between 70 and 110%. It means that the family that is used to go to the grocery and spend $100 for grocery will have to spend double. Now, I can guarantee you our salary will never be converted to that degree of inflation. And so how do we make sure that any extra value we're creating in the economy will not be somehow minimized or compromised by the fact that we'll have to compensate for food? So food, agriculture is an important conversation when we're looking at water, and of course manufacturing, because if we're able to manage and optimize water flows, we are somehow on one hand helping, but again, bear in mind self-interest is the best incentive. It's in our self-interest to address the water scarcity, because I can guarantee you it won't be a nice world if we have to fight for it. All it takes for you to travel to Saudi Arabia right now and feel what it feels like to have decreasing return on oil, being desperate for liquidity and asking Aramco to put 5% of their share on IPO, having the Chinese putting down on the table $2 trillion, and hoping that this will help diversify the economy. It shows you that, with all due respect, the short-sightedness of countries that have been spending most of the GDP on oil, like Saudi Arabia, where 70% of the GDP is only on oil, could be easily compromised by a major crisis around water. So this is really much more important than just the statistics. It's not coming from an environmentalist. I'm an economist at heart and in my training. And it's in my self-interest to try to figure out how can we try to address this so that we can return on the investment. We can say we have invested in a resource and now it's becoming much more effective, but being effective in this specific case means that I'm decreasing the input, in this case is the cost, and I'm extracting the value, which is the fact that, of course, there is capital to be extracted from something like this. D&R are really where the game has to be played more and more. As a follow-up to this, making sure that we also have time for some question. Climate change is equally becoming an opportunity and a threat. This is a graph from Parakana, who's a colleague who is a geostrategist. He basically was able to map what would happen if we become 4 degrees warmer. We currently are 1.5 degrees warmer. The Paris Agreement was trying to reduce this, but you know the Paris Agreement is currently going through the first institutional crisis. What you see in blue is areas that will be preserved. What you see in red is area that would be primarily either underwater or inhabitable. So we cannot afford to have that major change in our climate to the point in which we have to radically evolve our economic infrastructure to something we're not able to. We got too much prosperity in the world to be able to easily change. It's easier when you don't have much built, but when we have so much built infrastructure, it's not so easy anymore. So again, how do we bring this to the point in which it's become an economic imperative and a financial one, rather than simply an environmental one? I'll navigate towards, from DR towards DI. Again, inequalities, big conversation. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think we're all very aware of this. We mentioned 300 trillion in the financial economy, about 0.01% of the world population against the remainder. The 75% trillion in the real economy are spread around, of course, the remainder 99%. But bear in mind that out of the 75 trillion, 6 are in physical cash and the rest is digital. So our world economy is now 0 and 1, server to server. So it's important because digital currencies in general, they change the way consumption and growth happens, mainly because it's becoming a matter of algorithm rather than a matter of transaction like it used to be. Again, this is a usual picture, but I want to show you why we got to this point. One of the answers is probably digitalization. So our corporate profit percent of GDP have been growing. Our wages percent of GDP have been declining. This should not happen in traditional economic models. We should have some degree of proportionality between GDP growth and wages. We haven't. We have operated probably the best operational decoupling in history, and that happened most likely in elected government in probably the most visible democracy on earth, mainly because of maybe myopic macroeconomic policy that wanted to help the economy but inadvertently supported the financial players more. To show you a different perspective, over the last 50 years, 1950 to 2010, this is labor productivity. So we had a beautiful graph. Every business would like to look like this. Then you have in median indicator like real GDP and private employment. But look at family income. You notice that family income was growing in par, and at one point in time in the 80s has been slowed down, and it almost flattened out. Now is a plateau. This is an anomaly, should not happen in any economic model unless you plan for it. So this major decoupling, what you guys see here is, I think I have a laser, which is, yeah. This major decoupling here is abnormal. It should never happen. The problem with this is that it's generating enormous stress around the social welfare, but mainly the public debt. Because whenever we have in large entities, like for example banks, who are not able to pay their debt, private debt is becoming public debt. This is why whenever we're bailing out the bank, on one hand, we understand the fear of what would happen to the economy if a bank is collapsing. But bear in mind, every time we're bailing them out, private debt is becoming public debt. And over time, this has a lot of impact and pressure on investors' confidence. Because if you have a country that has a debt over 100%, investors will start worrying and wondering whether their money will ever be paid back. So it's important to consider that short-term measures sometimes seems to be reasonable, but many reasonable measures after one the other do not necessarily make a reasonable future. We had a lot of short-term reasonable measures that ended up creating an unreasonable future. So how do we make sure that we're understanding the impact of our intervention much more? From I of income, we see a life expectancy. So where a lot of value will also be seen is in the transition between healthcare versus sick care. Now, this is the life expectancy of people that are in the top 10% in terms of people that are in the bottom. The same for men and women. So men live about 12 years longer. Women, live about 12 years longer than men if they're in the upper part of the distribution income, and women about 8. Now, it means that we're going to see more and more disparity and diversity between those who can afford preventative care. There will be a whole set of financial incentive for them, and those who cannot afford this will have to incur into critical care, which means that they'll have to pay much more. In low-income countries, in low-income neighborhoods, where, for example, medical care is mainly critical, the spending per capita is way higher. So if you're running healthcare facilities, we should understand that preventative care is more expensive at first, but it becomes way less expensive at large. So how do we run risk across a way of hedging over time? I'm going to give you an experiment we did at Harvard. We have tried to imagine, you guys know in the US there is something called the Amish community that do not have health insurance. So they do not go to the doctor, but when one of their member of the family gets very sick, family will try to do everything possible to bring them to the hospital, and they have to walk through the ER. Now, we decided for a period of time to run free health care for them versus the traditional model. An interesting hospital, by giving 50,000 Amish free health care, would spend less through preventative care than if they have to deal and number them on critical care. It shows you that if we are able to manage health care over a long period of time, we'll understand that preventative care is much more relevant. Another very, very daunting comparison is cost of health care in a country like the US versus the cost of health care in a country like Germany. So in the last 3 months of life of a US citizen, there's the same spending in the last 12 years of life of a German citizen. That's mainly because Germany is a country where preventative care is institutionalized by the fact that people can go to the doctor. They won't financially break. But in the US, of course, it depends on your medical insurance. But it shows you that what seems to be a discount or less of an economic opportunity to give full coverage become a huge cost over time. So how do we visualize this cost now that data analytics allow us to make comparisons we have never seen before? The conversation on DR&I really bring us to understand that how do we find opportunities will be in determining how in the white spaces of some of the conversation we had, we'll be able to really bring the power of capital, bring the power of financial interest, bring the power of the financial industry to try to address these white spaces by operating with the same good rationale that we want to have a return for an investor. But the return won't happen in traditional market anymore. They are captured at the macro level. They have to happen in market that tends to look much more scaled out, or they might be less proportional, less linear to be found, as we have seen in some of the graph. I'll finish my my time before some of the question with the last two parts, intentionally shorter, volatility, scale, and complexity. Again, fascinating time to be alive because of the fact that, yes, we're going to see a major revolution in terms of jobs. Hopefully, it will not be as catastrophic as some of the statistics want to show. Hopefully, we'll create jobs that currently don't exist yet. Bear in mind that about 45% of the job in the workforce right now existed in some form about 100 years ago. So we think we're very modern, but many of the infrastructure jobs we have are pretty much the same that we had 100 years ago. So it's probably time for us to really think about modernizing some of this job and bringing millions of people to an entirely different set of skills. So one big conversation will be about jobs. Future work and future job is one of the projects I'm currently running for the World Economic Forum, and we're presenting our insight in Davos in January, so to a group of countries. So hopefully there will be some progress in this sense. Probability, again, being compromised by the fact that we no longer have the ability to forecast. So how do we forecast in times in which traditional methods don't work anymore? Here's a teaser. You all are very familiar about the bell curve. Now, the bell curve was introduced to define some degree of variance between the distance between the curve to the point in which you could have probability studies. So Mandelbrot calculated that a swing of more than 7% of the Dow Jones should only happen, according to the time in which this methodology was introduced, 300,000 years, once every 300,000 years. But in the 20th century, we had a swing of over 7% in the US 48 times. It shows you how much the theory is being outlived and outperformed by the practice. Nothing wrong with the theory in the first place, but it's important to notice that a lot of the theory was designed with a different expected performance than how our global economies have now shown. We're going into, of course, one of the salient conversations, artificial intelligence. This will become more and more of a conversation. This was one of the most interesting experiments. Who knows us better, our friends and family or an AI algorithm? This was done on Facebook. You see that the Phi trait is an instrument used in cognitive psychology to define personality traits. You see the performance of people around family, co-worker, spouse, and then you see the accuracy of the computer. So with the exception of the spouse, the computer was way more accurate in knowing personality traits than people that work with us. Now that's to give you a sense of what artificial intelligence does. It captured millions of inputs to turn into some sort of variability that tends to be much more accurate. So ahead of us, we'll have to imagine what will look like when things like artificial intelligence and blockchain will make it possible for us to have unforgetful technology that won't be able to forget anymore. They'll be extremely efficient. But how will we deal with the fact that most of our institutions are still very medieval and many of our emotions still very prehistoric? We have to reconcile three major dilemmas: godlike technology, medieval institution, and very prehistoric emotion. So AI is a force for good if we're going to use it to maximize human well-being, but if we let it simply learn by itself without any sort of intermediation, it's designed to be way more efficient than us, right? It's what it's supposed to be. So we can't necessarily think that we're going to be surprised one day when most of the labor force might be displaced by technology. We have to use it, but for the purpose of creating value, not for the purpose of extracting and replacing value. Final conversation I'd like to have with you is, where is the innovation coming from? So 4 types of innovation: customer-focused, efficiency-driven, engineering-based, and science-based. These were the 4 main pillars where consulting firms were thinking about where our innovation portfolio is coming from. Now, you would imagine a country like China did not rise on the ashes of this model. In fact, China was not considered for a long period of time as an innovative country. But if we're looking at the performance of Chinese products in a scale where we're looking at the 4 different areas I mentioned before, you see science, you have, here is the name science, customer efficiency, and engineer. And you say the US is in blue, where the US is having areas of excellence. The Chinese production is currently becoming a direct competitor, a contender to the US innovation. In some category, like for example, in solar panel, China has no competitor so far. Commercial drones, railroads, most of the metro and city are produced in China. Household appliances. We have an increasing amount of innovation coming from a country that was not historically a country based on innovation. So how will we deal with the fact that innovation will come from a country where there's not the same requirement for capital, mainly because they're learning from the foreign technology, accelerated their ability to adopt this into their production, but also the fact that they will be able to take existing technology and contextualize this to their own market. We see this with example of what WeChat was able to do in terms of integrating one of the most fledgling payment option in the world, which is WeChat, Alipay. This is the first effort of really bypassing the banking system as a whole. It's much easier for a Chinese to buy a hot dog on the street with a barcode than for us in the Western world. It shows you that their degree of digitalization will give them an advantage that we might not really see in countries where the infrastructure stock is still relatively old and it requires a long period of time. This is why we have to understand how this rising pressure on things like blockchain, cryptocurrency, and fintech are really going to modernize our financial system rather than thinking they're only disruption. Because if we're not digitalizing, our ability to compete with the global economy will decrease, as there is a direct correlation between digitalization, productivity, and prosperity. And so ahead of us, we can see more and more cases like this in which growth will look much more organized by anyone that can participate, much more aggressive geostrategic competition from countries around the world. The emerging economy like China and India will not be second in class anymore. They'll be able to enter into the market with their own products. Some of you might use today a Lenovo computer. This was unthinkable 10 years ago, thinking that you could use a Chinese computer, although Apple is Chinese, but that's a different story. It's producing, it's manufactured in China. Some of us decided to go not from Samsung or from Apple, but to go, for example, in Xiaomi or OnePlus. So we have already a visible presence of this product in our lifetime. It won't take long before Alibaba will equate to what, for example, Amazon is doing in the US in having access to retailing. They already are the largest e-commerce platform on earth, and e-commerce and digitalization, they work at the same time. Just again, a teaser. Black Friday in the US, you guys know, is a big event for Americans because of sales concentrated into one day. So average sales of the Black Friday is about 2 billion. China is now doing the same in something called 11/11, which is the single day, is the 11th of November, where mainly through Alibaba, they were able to raise 14 billion. Now, we're looking at exponential numbers here, and this only happens because they don't have the same cost of adoption technology, but they have the ability to contextualize and distribute it much faster than the traditional players. To sum up, and we have a few minutes for conversation, when we're looking at the opportunities ahead of us, the opportunity have to be found in everything that we consider to be the white spaces in where growth is currently being distributed. So how will you empower your own organizations and your teams to start discovering things that tends to be much more related to pain points, field witnesses, things that people are noticing, certain future, things that we know for a fact that will happen. So how do we generate a number of proxies in our organization to find growth differently from how we found growth historically? I'm not saying to replace, I'm saying complement it. Use macroeconomic analysis to determine trends that you find easy to capture because they will aggregate. But bear in mind that most of the lucrative market growth is not aggregated anymore because it's distributed across channel. They do not make it easy to be captured with traditional statistics. So how do you find a way to create instruments of analysis that also measure these white spaces so that you can think about growth not only as a matter of verticalization that scales up, but a growth that is also horizontal and scales out.